7,000 years ago, a man lived in the mountains of what is now northern Spain. He hunted animals, gathered wild plants, and lived before farming had fully transformed that part of Europe. Genetically, he was an ancient European hunter-gatherer. He probably had blue eyes, and his skin may have been considerably darker than the skin of most people living in Spain today. Dark skin, blue eyes, living in prehistoric Europe. He would have completely confused a modern costume designer. That combination sounds unusual only because we have been trained to expect skin color, eye color, hair color, and geography to arrive as one fixed package. They do not. The first modern humans who entered Europe did not immediately become pale. Some populations retained relatively dark pigmentation for thousands of years. Others already carried variants associated with lighter skin. Eye color could change before skin color. Neighboring groups could look different from one another. Europe was not slowly turning white, as though someone were adjusting one enormous brightness setting. It was a patchwork of people migrating, mixing, separating, and adapting at different speeds. Which raises a much bigger question. Modern humans originated in Africa, and our early ancestors were probably dark-skinned. So why did some of their descendants eventually evolve lighter skin? The answer begins with sunlight. But not because the sun simply makes people darker or lighter. Your skin is performing two jobs that appear to contradict each other. It must block sunlight, and it must allow sunlight to enter. Too much ultraviolet radiation can damage cells and interfere with important biological processes. Too little ultraviolet radiation makes it harder for the skin to produce enough vitamin D, which supports bones, muscles, development, and many other functions. So human skin is not just a covering. It is a biological light filter, and evolution has spent hundreds of thousands of years adjusting the strength of that filter. To understand why, we have to go back before human skin looked the way it does today. Far enough back, and our ancestors were covered in much more body hair. Fur provided protection from sunlight. Look beneath the coat of many mammals, and the skin underneath may be much lighter than the animal appears from the outside. The fur is doing much of the protective work. Then, our ancestors began losing most of that thick coat. The exact timeline remains difficult to reconstruct because hair does not leave a generous fossil record. Archaeologists can find a skull, a tooth, or a stone tool. They do not usually find a neatly preserved prehistoric haircut. But the change was probably connected to one of the most unusual human abilities: sweating. Humans are not impressive sprinters compared with many animals. Place an average person beside an antelope and the athletic competition becomes emotionally difficult almost immediately. But humans are excellent at releasing heat during long periods of activity. We have large numbers of sweat glands spread across mostly exposed skin. When sweat evaporates, it cools the body. Dense body hair would interfere with that system. As our ancestors became increasingly active in hot, open environments, bodies that could lose heat efficiently gained an advantage. Much of the thick hair disappeared, and sweating became one of our greatest endurance adaptations. That solved the heat problem. Then it created a sunlight problem. Skin that had once been protected beneath hair was now directly exposed to powerful tropical ultraviolet radiation. The old fur coat was gone. Something had to replace it. That something was melanin. Melanin is the pigment responsible for much of the visible variation in human skin, hair, and eyes. All normally pigmented humans produce it. People with darker skin do not possess a completely different type of skin from people with lighter skin. Humans broadly share the same basic pigment system. The differences involve how much pigment is produced, which forms are produced, how it is packaged, how it is distributed, and how long it remains in surrounding skin cells. The darker form, known as eumelanin, is particularly effective at absorbing and dispersing ultraviolet radiation. As our ancestors lost body hair under intense African sunlight, permanent dark pigmentation became powerful biological protection. Dark skin was not an unfinished stage waiting to become light. It was a sophisticated adaptation to one of the most ultraviolet intense environments inhabited by humans. But what exactly was it protecting? Sunburn is an obvious answer. Skin cancer is another. Both matter, but they may not tell the complete evolutionary story. Many common skin cancers develop later in life. Natural selection is strongest when a trait affects survival and reproduction before or during the years when people are likely to have children. Another important part of the explanation may involve folate. Folate is required for cell division, DNA production, healthy fetal development, sperm production, and successful reproduction. Ultraviolet radiation can contribute to the breakdown of folate and related molecules. Imagine folate as fragile biological currency. The body needs it to build new cells and produce healthy offspring. Intense sunlight is constantly attempting to reduce the amount available. Melanin places a protective barrier between that radiation and the biological systems depending on folate. This is one of the leading explanations for why strongly pigmented skin became favored in regions with intense ultraviolet radiation. But it is probably not the only explanation. Pigmentation also protects DNA, supports the skin barrier, and helps exposed skin function under environmental stress. Important adaptations rarely exist for only one reason. Evolution is less like an inventor building one tool for one job, and more like someone discovering that the same tool can repair the roof, open a coconut, and keep a door closed during a storm. Dark pigmentation offered several forms of protection at once. Near the equator, the balance made sense. The sunlight was strong. Ultraviolet exposure remained relatively intense through much of the year. The body could still produce vitamin D despite having a dense melanin filter, because there was plenty of ultraviolet energy available. Then, humans began moving. Modern human groups expanded beyond tropical Africa and entered Western Asia, Europe, Central Asia, Eastern Asia, and eventually nearly every major environment on the planet. The farther some populations traveled from the equator, the more the behavior of sunlight changed. In northern regions, the sun remains lower in the sky, especially during winter. Its radiation passes through more of the atmosphere before reaching the ground. A large portion of the ultraviolet B needed for vitamin D production is scattered or absorbed. For part of the year, useful ultraviolet B may become extremely limited. Then the weather becomes cold. People begin covering more of their bodies with animal hides and clothing. They spend longer periods inside shelters. All of this is excellent when the alternative is freezing. It is less convenient when the skin is trying to operate a sunlight-powered chemical factory. The same melanin shield that protected ancestors in equatorial Africa could now block a significant portion of the weak ultraviolet radiation reaching northern skin. A solution had become a limitation, and evolution faced a new balancing problem. Keep strong pigmentation and protect against ultraviolet damage, or allow more ultraviolet light through and make vitamin D production easier. The environment had changed the value of the filter. This did not mean that people with dark skin immediately became unable to survive outside Africa. Humans are far too flexible for such a simple story. Food can provide vitamin D. Migration routes passed through many different environments. Clothing, shelter, seasonal behavior, and cultural practices altered exposure. Different groups faced different combinations of diet and sunlight. But where ultraviolet B was weak and dietary vitamin D was limited, producing the vitamin efficiently could provide an advantage. Severe vitamin D deficiency in growing children can cause rickets, leaving bones soft or poorly formed. Muscles may weaken. Legs can bend under body weight. The pelvis can develop abnormally. In a prehistoric world built around walking, carrying, hunting, gathering, and childbirth, poor skeletal development was not a minor inconvenience. A genetic variant allowing slightly more ultraviolet B to enter the skin could help the body produce vitamin D more efficiently. That person would not suddenly become pale. The difference might be small, perhaps almost impossible to notice. But if the change improved health or reproductive success, that variant could become slightly more common in the next generation, then slightly more common again. Evolution does not need one enormous transformation. It needs small differences, repeated for a very long time. No ancient child woke up one morning with skin completely unlike that of both parents. No community gathered around a fire and decided that everyone should produce less melanin before the next winter. The change happened through countless ordinary births. Each child inherited a mixture of variants. Some combinations produced slightly lighter pigmentation. In certain environments, those combinations sometimes offered an advantage. Across many generations, the average pigmentation of the population shifted. But ancient DNA has destroyed the clean, simple version of this story. The first people to enter Europe did not immediately evolve the appearance of modern Northern Europeans. For thousands of years, ancient Europe contained people with combinations rarely seen there today. The hunter-gatherer from Spain is one of the clearest examples. His remains were discovered at a site known as La Branya. Scientists recovered enough DNA to examine variants associated with physical traits. He carried ancestral forms of several important skin pigmentation genes, suggesting that the very light skin common in much of modern Europe was not yet universal. At the same time, he carried a variant strongly associated with blue eyes. His face reminds us of something evolution never promised. Traits do not have to change together. Skin color can follow one path. Eye color can follow another. Hair can follow a third. The combinations familiar today are temporary results of population history, not permanent rules written into humanity. And La Brogna was not proof that every European hunter-gatherer looked exactly like him. That would simply replace one oversimplification with another. Ancient groups varied. Some Western hunter-gatherers appear to have retained darker pigmentation relatively late. Some Eastern hunter-gatherer populations carried light pigmentation variants at higher frequencies. People living thousands of kilometers apart were not one identical population, simply because archaeologists placed them under the same broad label. Europe did not become light-skinned all at once. Then farming changed more than food. Agriculture developed in Western Asia and expanded into Europe with migrating farming populations. These newcomers mixed with local hunter-gatherers. They brought crops, domesticated animals, new settlement patterns, and different ancestry. Some also carried pigmentation variants that later became common in European populations. This matters because traits do not always spread only by appearing as new mutations inside one population. Sometimes people carrying an existing variant move into a new region. They have children with local groups. The variant enters a new genetic background. Natural selection may then increase its frequency if the local environment favors it. Migration supplied some of the pieces. Selection changed how common those pieces became. Later, pastoralist groups connected to the Eurasian steppe moved across large parts of Europe during the Bronze Age. They mixed with farmers and descendants of hunter-gatherers. Modern European ancestry was gradually assembled through repeated population movements, not through one isolated tribe, changing color while remaining genetically separate from everyone else. Think of prehistoric Europe as several rivers joining. One carried hunter-gatherer ancestry. Another carried ancestry from early farming communities. Another came from steppe pastoralists. When the rivers merged, the result contained material from all of them. Natural selection then acted on the combined population. By the Bronze Age, variants associated with lighter skin had become common across much of Europe, but the timeline was not identical for every gene or every region. One major light pigmentation variant became widespread earlier. Another rose later. The modern European pigment profile was assembled piece by piece, and agriculture may have strengthened the pressure. Many hunter-gatherer diets included wild meat, fish, eggs, organs, shellfish, and other foods that could provide vitamin D or nutrients supporting skeletal health. Early farming communities often depended heavily on cultivated grains. Grain is excellent at feeding large populations. It can be stored. It can support cities. It can also make the average goat feel increasingly important. But grain is not a particularly impressive vitamin D source. Settled agricultural life changed diet, disease exposure, daily movement, clothing, and time spent outdoors. In northern environments, a population eating less vitamin D-rich food may have depended more heavily on producing the vitamin through skin exposure. A pigmentation variant that once provided only a small advantage could become more valuable after the diet changed. Culture had rewritten the biological problem. This pattern appears throughout human evolution. We invent something to solve one difficulty. The invention changes our environment. The changed environment creates a new pressure on our bodies. Agriculture did not stop evolution. It gave evolution a new workplace. But Europe was only part of the story. East Asia reached a similar answer using partly different genetic routes. Many East Asian populations also evolved lighter average pigmentation after their ancestors moved into regions with lower and more seasonal ultraviolet radiation. For a long time, it was tempting to assume that light skin everywhere came from the same ancient mutation. The genetics tell a different story. Several variants strongly associated with light skin in Europe are uncommon in East Asia. East Asian populations experienced selection on other parts of the pigmentation system. The visible result could be similar. The biological route was not. This is convergent evolution. Different populations encounter a comparable environmental problem and independently evolve comparable solutions. It is like two groups reaching the same river. One builds a bridge. The other builds a boat. Both reach the opposite bank. They did not use the same engineering plan. European and East Asian populations did not need to inherit one universal light skin package from a single ancestral group. Natural selection could adjust different genes within the same basic human pigment system. The sunlight problem was similar. Evolution's answer was not. And even latitude did not decide everything. Consider populations living in Arctic environments. Ultraviolet B is extremely limited for long periods. Yet not every high-latitude population evolved the very light pigmentation found in parts of northern Europe. Why? Diet could change the equation. Traditional diets rich in oily fish, marine mammals, and other animal foods could provide substantial vitamin D. When food supplies part of what weak sunlight cannot, the pressure for extreme depigmentation may be reduced. The body does not care whether vitamin D began with sunlight or arrived with dinner. It cares whether enough becomes available. So, skin color cannot be explained by latitude alone. Sunlight mattered. Deal mattered. Clothing mattered. Migration mattered. Population mixing mattered. Culture mattered. Chance mattered. The human body was responding to an entire system, not reading one line on a map. This is why the phrase, humans changed from black to white, is biologically misleading. Human pigmentation does not exist as two boxes. It forms a broad spectrum. Even the lightest, normally pigmented skin contains melanin. Dark skin also varies greatly between individuals and populations. People tan differently. Pigmentation changes between body regions. Age, hormones, health, and sun exposure can all affect appearance. The social labels black and white are powerful because humans have built histories, identities, and systems around them, but they describe biological variation poorly. Evolution did not create separate categories of human beings. It adjusted a shared pigment system in populations living under different environmental conditions. Lighter skin is not more evolved than darker skin. Dark skin is not an ancient feature that evolution forgot to remove. Every living population has been evolving for exactly the same amount of time. Dark pigmentation remains highly effective protection in regions with intense ultraviolet radiation. Very light skin allows efficient vitamin D production under weak ultraviolet conditions, but is more vulnerable to ultraviolet damage. Neither is universally superior. Each represents a compromise. Place very light skin under intense tropical sunlight without protection, and its disadvantages become obvious. Place strongly pigmented skin in a low ultraviolet environment while also limiting dietary vitamin D, and a different difficulty may emerge. There is no perfect human skin color for every location. There are only different filters adapted to different combinations of sunlight, diet, and behavior. Then modern life scrambled the map. For most of history, human populations moved slowly enough for biology, ancestry, and geography to remain partly connected. Today, a person can cross from northern Europe to equatorial Africa within a single day. A family with generations of ancestry in a high ultraviolet region can settle in a city with dark winters. A person can live in a tropical country while spending nearly every daylight hour inside an office, vehicle, or building. We now live behind glass. We use sunscreen. We wear manufactured clothing. We obtain vitamin D from food, fortified products, and supplements. Culture changes our exposure faster than natural selection can change our genes. The environment moved. Our pigmentation did not have time to follow. This does not mean everyone living outside the environment of their ancestors is unhealthy. Modern behavior and medicine provide many ways to manage ultraviolet exposure and nutrition. It means skin color still carries information about the past, even when it no longer matches the place where a person lives. Return now to the man in prehistoric Spain. He opens his blue eyes beneath the European sun. His skin may be darker than that of many people who will live in the same region thousands of years later. He does not know he is unusual. In his world, he may not be unusual at all. The surprising part exists only inside our modern expectations. After his lifetime, farming populations will continue spreading across Europe. Hunter-gatherers and farmers will mix. Steppe pastoralists will move west. Pigmentation variant will rise and fall. Diet and sunlight will change the value of those variants. Across generations, the average appearance of many European populations will become lighter. Elsewhere, East Asian populations will reach a partly similar result through different genetic changes. Arctic populations will solve part of the vitamin D problem through food. Tropical populations will retain the protection needed beneath intense ultraviolet radiation. No single transformation will create the modern spectrum. It will emerge from thousands of migrations and millions of births. That is why some ancient humans evolved lighter skin, not because one race became another. Not because white skin represented progress. Not because dark skin disappeared. Some populations evolved lighter pigmentation because their ancestors carried a body adapted to tropical sunlight into environments where ultraviolet radiation followed different rules. Dark skin acted as a powerful shield where sunlight was intense. Lighter skin allowed more weak ultraviolet B to enter where vitamin D was harder to produce. Human skin kept adjusting the filter. Your skin is still performing that compromise right now. It protects the body from part of the outside world while allowing another part to enter. It carries the memory of sunlight experienced by people you will never meet. People who crossed deserts, forests, coastlines, grasslands, mountains, and frozen valleys. People who met other populations, formed families, and passed on new combinations of genes. Skin color is not a wall dividing different kinds of humans. It is a record. A biological map of sunlight, movement, food, culture, and survival. And every shade belongs to the same human story.